The hosting capacity, methods for improving the hosting capacity. So here first method is new or stronger feeder. So when we want to improve the hosting capacity, either we should use new or we should replace the feeders, right? So here first, increasing a cross section of the conductor by adding more copper will in almost all cases result in a higher hosting capacity. So what they are saying, so we are already having a existing conductor, so in that, so for example here the copper content, adding more copper, okay. So for example this line, adding more copper lines, adding more copper will in almost all cases result in higher hosting capacity. So we need to increase the cross section of a conductor. So next is building a completely new feeder. In many cases in the form of an underground cable could be easier than strengthening on existing feeder. So instead of repairing or instead of replacing the exist one, they are saying that building a completely new feeder, that too underground cable, okay, underground cable, it is easier than strengthening an existing feeder. But what happens if we replace the exist one? This is a exist one and this is a new one, okay. So when you compare new one, it takes time and it is costly, and while replacing new one, it will be problem to the customers because we do the interruption. Sorry, it is costly and it is time taken, okay. But when we replace with the exist one, it is cheaper one, and it will be problem to the customers because we do the interruption, okay. So here what they are saying is dedicated feeder. For example, if it is a large units, okay, so dedicated feeder in case of large units connected to weak parts of the grid are commonly used solution. So here dedicated feeder is that it can be designed to prevent any overloading. So the solution is however practically only for the large units. So when it comes to the larger units, we can use a dedicated feeder, but when it comes to the small units, we cannot use a dedicated feeder, okay. For small units, the cost of new feeder will be high compared to the total cost of the unit, okay. So for example, small generation units will be there, okay, small generation units. For that, if you go with a new feeder, then it will be huge cost. Better to rewire or replace the existing one, okay, for a smaller unit, okay. So for small units, the cost of the new feeder will be high compared to the total cost of the unit. Also, the cost of new feeder will be highest when the generator is located further away from the medium voltage substation. So somewhere it will be small unit, okay. For example, it may be the solar or it may be the wind. So or it may be the small CHP, okay. So somewhere it will be far away from the substation, okay. So then it will be huge cost to transmit the power, right. So better to replace the existing one or rewire the feeder. So better to rewire the feeder or parts of the feeder instead of small cross section of a cable. If it is a less, we should increase the cross section of the cable, okay. So thinner to thicker. So rewiring the feeder or parts of the feeder with a thicker wire will be cheaper than building a completely new feeder. It will also be easier to obtain permission for rewiring an existing. So if you want to build a new feeder, then we need a lot of permissions for this, right? So better to go with the rewiring. So for that it will be less permissions is required, and we can do it in a less cost. But what is the disadvantage is it causes long planned interruptions for existing customers if we do the rewiring. So replacing lines by cables with the same cross section without any further measures might reduce the hosting capacity. So replacing lines with the lines by cables. So if we do, so for instead of copper wire, if we replace with the aluminum wire with the same cross section and without measuring anything, designing the over voltage limit or anything, then it will be reduce the hosting capacity. So the voltage drop during a minimum load, which is partly due to reactive power demand, becomes less, whereas the voltage rise due to distributed generation remains the same. There is a thus less generation needed to reach the over voltage limit. So here hosting capacity also increased by using a shorter feeders. The main cost associated with this is that transformer and substations are needed. If we use a shorter feeder, then it can be used. Hosting capacity is also increased by shorter feeder, but what is the problem with that is it is a cost is associated with the, again we needed more transformers and substations we require. Okay, if we use a for example 100 kilometer is there, if we go on using for the 50 kilometer, then 2 times we require. Okay, so like that we need a more transformers and substation if we use a shorter feeder, but we can increase the hosting capacity. This is the first method of to increase the hosting capacity.